Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 386. It's April the 27th, 1979, and we've tucked one more month away. I can't believe they go so fast, but that's it. This is the end of April, and side one of this tape. It seems bizarre to talk about such grotesque items in the news each week, the depressing and the sad events, and I get telephone calls from people and letters that they're upset with the kind of news and information. They appreciate and like the news, but it's very upsetting to them. But I have to tell you that on the other side there are compensating factors, and along with it you have to build some philosophy of life and belief in what you're doing and enjoyment of what you're doing. And of course, as the spring and summer come, the contrast to heavy news, in case you feel sorry for me or think I'm burdened in depression, I'm not. I love May, June, and July. I have family members' birthdays. Two are Taurus, one's a Cancer in June. I have a birthday, a Gemini in May. We have a Gemini party here. I have about 20 close friends that are all Geminis. I'm particularly close to people I don't know. We hit it off really well and then find out that we are Gemini. So we have a Gemini party, and in June I have a series of parties and family events. There's birthdays and anniversaries and celebrations, and there's a lot that happens in my own personal family, May, June, and July, and it's really a very happy, warm time and a lot of fun, and I take a lot of time off, so don't worry about me. And we have a lot of good times outdoors and picnicking and parties, and it's, I guess, recuperating from the winter seasons, which I like, the Thanksgiving and Christmas, Hanukkah, and so forth. But the late spring and the summer are particularly very close, because all of these people that I am very, very close to, they seem to fall into, their celebrations fall into this time period. So while the news is bad and we go through some pretty heavy things, don't worry. May is having a good time, and I really feel good, particularly this time of year. It's a lot of fun, and there's a lot of warm people that I love very much all around the year. But there seems to be a congregation of them this particular time that we get together. So you have fun, too. I hope you do. And don't worry. As we go into things like Alternative 3 and Colonia, DIGNIDAD, and so forth, just remember that as long as we're pursuing them and going after them, that's half the struggle, identifying the problems and recognizing that something has to be done, and even opening up our awareness puts them more to be exposed and to be understood. And that is the beginning of the solving of a problem, is to recognize it in the first place. And that's what these tapes are about. I can't write individually to each one of you who mails me articles now, because so many people are taking tapes, and you're sending me articles and books, and you always say, don't bother to write, just let me know you received it. And I do want to thank you 1,000 times. I'm getting some wonderful material, and I really do appreciate it. Last week on the tape, we made practically the whole time was about the Chilean government, the military junta, the West German cult there, the concentration camp. That was based upon an article by Conrad Egg in Counterspy magazine, and it's a story of this place, an orphanage down in Chile, that is used for torture by the DINA, and it also has been exposed by various groups, and the West German government suppresses the information. The United Nations suppresses the information. On December the 4th, 1972, Chilean President Salvador Allende went to the United Nations because he had been elected in that as president of that country, and he couldn't get it off the ground. The civil war was being funded by the Central Intelligence Agency and the ITT, the multinational corporations that wanted to put in a slave labor dictatorship so that their profits would be much greater than having to pay fair prices to labor organizations in Chile while we drain them of their resources. Allende went to the United Nations and accused specifically the ITT of attempting to bring civil war to Chile. Now we all know the links of ITT and John Mitchell and Richard Nixon's administration and Richard Helms. That was just one one part of the problem. But Allende went to the United Nations and accused them of bringing civil war to Chile, and he described it this is a quote, the greatest possible source of disintegration of a country, end quotes. And he provided memos to prove that the intent was, end quote, create violence, economic chaos, and uprisings that alter free democratic elections, end quotes. He went to the United Nations and appealed for help because his country was in such turmoil by the multinationals of the United States of America. And of course, Salvador Allende was murdered, and the same location, this Colonia Dignidad that had been used for harboring Nazis since World War II as a meeting place for Nazis, became a torture center under the guise of a Christian orphanage down in Chile, and the police use it now today, and the United Nations suppressed it. Even after Allende was murdered, the United Nations suppressed the appeals of Amnesty International and the various reports to go into Chile and find out just what happened after Salvador Allende was murdered. I'm going to run down the comparisons, as I said, of Colonia Dignidad to Jonestown. Now, Colonia Dignidad in Chile, that was this orphanage, had 7,500 acres, according to this article in Counterspy. Jonestown, Jim Jones, rented more than that amount of acres. He rented 27,000 acres, 27,000 isolated acres, bordering Venezuela on a river. And that's a lot of acres. If on 7,500 acres you couldn't find the torturing, the screaming, or the top Nazis in isolation while you ran an agricultural farm, Jim Jones had 27,000 acres in Guyana. The Colonia Dignidad was south of Santiago, but close to it, a province near there, the capital of Chile, where it was accessible. The arrangement for Jim Jones when he went to Matthews Ridge in '63 and saw the property that was 35 miles from Matthews Ridge, which was a CIA station that he was to rent, was that it would be near Georgetown but far enough away, about 125 miles, but you'd have to take a boat or fly or go to Matthews Ridge and take a train, so that they were near large cities. And incidentally, the airport at Georgetown, the U.S. Army airport there, I guess it was British originally, but built up by the U.S. Army, is the largest airport in all of South America. That's where the CIA was sending troops to Angola, anti-Castro Cubans, and arms to South America, and could still be using it for that purpose. There's no reason to put it in the past tense. But it's a large airport in Georgetown, and there was a large city, Santiago, next to the Colonia Dignidad in Chile. The third comparison was that the Chilean agricultural farm was a model farm operated by 250 West Germans. Jonestown was operated by approximately 250 Americans and British. Now, the names of the people who rented the property are still unknown. There were scientists. I heard Tim Stone from Stanford, a lawyer from Stanford who was the attorney for Jim Jones, say there were people from MIT, there were professors, there was a man from England, Debbie Blakey's husband. We don't know where their money came from or who they were, but the entourage of, say, the 110 that are still living, mostly white, I am sure, and the people that set up, the mechanics of Jonestown that arranged it, rented it, and protected it, was operated, I suppose, by about 250 people. If the model farm in Chile had 250, if 110 left, and 110 even died with Jim Jones, the arrangement to control that many people, and those survivors that are out now would number about 250. Another comparison between the two was that the money for Colonial Dignidad came from West Germany, from the West German government, and the money for Jonestown came both from Germany, a conduit from Mrs. Layton's father and Mrs. Layton, who gave several $100,000 to Jim Jones, who even died down there. Her family gave a lot of money, their military family, German family, and there was another source of German money, and that has yet never been disclosed, and if they have $26 million in overseas banks, there must be an interest and other investments. The money came from the government also. There were welfare checks, payment checks to people. There was a federal agent that went down there and hand-delivered money to Jones every month, I understand. And so that the United States government and West Germany were putting money into Jonestown, and the German government was sending money down to Chile to this model farm. Another factor is that once they were set up, they were economically self-sufficient. That's the fifth comparison, that they created what they call farming areas. In one case, they had small factories in Chile, and they became economically self-sufficient so that the people on the farm didn't have to leave to go anywhere else to have a job. There was nobody who lived on the farm who was a secretary, went into town and worked for somebody. Now, the People's Temple in Los Angeles and San Francisco or Ukiah, the members were visible until they got down to the farm where the real experimentations could take place, you see. But once they got down to the Chilean farm, or once they were sent down to Jonestown, they weren't visible except those that were assigned to Georgetown, so that it became a self-sufficient operation. And the Jonestown people were, I understand, made dolls and baskets, and after the deaths, they were selling them in Georgetown. But they were supposed to be able to grow their own food and live off of the food and make products to sell that were sold by few members outside, and that way it kept them isolated. Nobody could come in and see them, and the production was self-contained. In each case, they had their own hospital. Now, this is typical of a CIA intelligence operation, too. If an agent is hurt, he doesn't go to the general hospital. There's specific places, and they kind of even have dental care unless it's a CIA dentist, because under the influence of some medication at the time to relieve the pain, they may talk or speak about their professions. So they kept them in their own hospitals. Now, part of the Jonestown operation was a hospital in Venezuela also. There was medication, and I believe there was a connecting link hospital. That the first count of babies and adults, the 403 count, became 913. I believe it's possible that more bodies came from somewhere, because the beds at Jonestown, I understand, didn't equal 900 beds. There were 913 dead, but a maximum of something like 600 beds. That's never been fully written up, but there were never 913 sleeping accommodations, and yet there are 913 beds. There were airplanes that took the people away from Jonestown, and no one knows who went away or where, or whether they died or had been tortured or what. But when the news people arrived on small airplanes to first go to Jonestown, the pilots said, oh yes, the planes flew in and went out frequently or every month with patients who needed medical care of some kind. So there was this private transportation for the sick that we still don't know what airplanes they were on or who they were or what medical care they needed. And in the case of Colonia DIGNIDAD, they had their own ambulances. And one person who escaped from there or got out from the torture and had gone to Amnesty International had said that they were driven in ambulances to the torture place. And that is a perfect way to transport somebody who can't scream and yell out of a window. You can imagine, if you have your own hospital or medical units, how marvelous this is, because you put someone down in a bed, you can inject them with a needle, you can strap their arms and legs. It's not that they're sitting in a car and can scream out a car window, or somebody can chase them and realize that they're being hurt or victimized or follow. You can't follow ambulances very far, and most of them are closed up. So hearse and ambulances are marvelous ways to transport people, so that they each had their own hospital, and the location in Chile, its own ambulances, and then they have their own schools, so the children don't leave, and they only learn what you want them to learn. And in the case of Jonestown, he had his own school and educational system. There's one thing I keep remembering that Mark Lane said, that doctors flew in constantly to Jonestown, that it was like an Albert Schweitzer operation, and I keep referring to this, medical experts from all over the world, and they wanted to check out this fantastic place down in South America. I wonder if Dr. Mengeles, the boys from Brazil, Mengeles, had been there by way of coming up north from Brazil or in through Venezuela. We would never know. I understand, and I'll do more on it later, that he's still doing experimentations on Indians in Paraguay, that the medical experiments of the Nazi concentration camps are being conducted today by Dr. Mengeles down in Paraguay, and I believe it, and I believe that he could come into Jonestown and do the same thing. So you have these agricultural farms that are self-contained with their own hospitals and their own educational system, with their income coming from children, orphanages, on the one hand, coming from West Germany, and sending over these small children, and then in Jonestown, wards of the welfare systems, adopted children, and there were some children that Jim Jones had up in Ukiah and elsewhere that they wanted the money for keeping them in their home, and they used these children as a cover for their great altruistic social project. So they would, in quotes, adopt these children and use them as a shield, and money came from the state for them to house them, and the checks came in, and it made them appear to be very liberal, whereas they were very racist and Nazi, and it was a fascist camp in both cases. Another similarity that I noticed, the AIDS one here, is that very few visitors were allowed at Chile. This article on Colonia DIGNIDAD said very, very few visitors were ever allowed into that property, that 7,500 acres, and we know that Jonestown had very few visitors, and that the government, Burnham, that the CIA put in power in Georgetown, in Guyana, screened out anybody who wanted to see Jim Jones, and they would phone him by radio communication, and tell him who wanted to come and what they wanted to do, and would screen them out, and families would come and get as far as Guyana and couldn't get to the agricultural center, if it was this paradise or whatever. Very, very few visitors came, and the visitors that did come, in the one case we know in Jonestown, were shown people who were prompted to smile and dance and sing and put on a good show. So another factor you just can't take out of I can't take it from my mind, is this isolation, no contact with anybody. And the article on Colonial Dignidad said it was this perfect way to do what they wanted with the property and with people, because economically independent and isolation creates a fascist, the nucleus of a fascist situation where you're totally dependent upon whoever opens the gates or directs your life for all of your food, emotional needs, friendships. Whoever enters and leaves, you're dependent upon them. So each was isolated, close to a country that is sympathetic to fascism and the multinational corporations, with the intent to have a hands-off policy. Even though there were complaints in reports, documentation, they turned their back. Now, Hermann Schmidt was the director of Colonial Dignidad. Of course, this was a German government, and I think of Larry Schmidt and Volkmar Schmidt, and I still want to do a tape for you, in their role in the Kennedy assassination back in '63. But Lawrence Schacht is a name, an unusual name, was the doctor of Jonestown who cooked up the final concoction. He was the sole doctor, and again, as Lane talked, you'd think that he was one of a team of doctors. But those of you that study German history know Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was head of the Reichsbank that funded Adolf Hitler, poured money into the Middle East, beginning in May of 1948. As soon as Israel became a country, they began arming the Middle East against Israel, and to make sure that they would get their holy war someday and wipe them out. And Hjalmar Schacht funded Aristotle Onassis' ships that began to build up Germany and Japan after World War II. This Lawrence Schacht comes from Houston, Texas, a conduit of CIA. That's a city that is thick with CIA agents that were involved in the Kennedy assassination. The family background would be interesting to see if he belongs, the family, mother and father, to a Nazi cell such as the Bormann Brotherhood, because Schacht is a name that rings through this period, and the family, of course, is an unknown family to us. We don't know anything about them any more than we know about Werner von Braun's family or any of the other Nazis that came to the United States, or Henry Kissinger's family for that matter. Another thing that these two camps had in common was the guards. They used guards to keep people out. It was physically isolated where you couldn't escape or go out, But at Colonia Dignidad, they had 3 plainclothes policemen, and they escorted a West German journalist out of Chile when he wanted information about the place, and they had guards that guarded the environment, even though it would be difficult to leave. And there were guards at Jonestown. There were guards at San Francisco and in Ukiah. There was barbed wire fence. There were police dogs. There were men with guns, and if you wanted to flee, they caught you. So once you got in and your passport was turned over, that was the end of the line in both places. There was no reason to believe that anybody could live, or very few could live, except those who maybe transported money back and forth to the banks and could get out, like Terry Buford and Debbie Blakey and some of the people that made these transports. Marie Casares didn't live and was totally brainwashed, although she made trips and deposited money and could have fled if she wanted to, but she didn't. But there were guards there, and there were equipments and radios at Colonia Dignidad and German Shepherds, and there were guards, as I say, in Mendocino, and radio equipment and dogs to make sure, and weapons to make sure that nobody ever left. I think the reason for the fear of their leaving is that they did have these visible armbands, and were being experimented upon, and anybody who got out of there in that zombie state, or in various degrees of possibly being pregnant or other experimentations, the place would have come down and been blown wide open, and they couldn't afford to have anybody leave, except those that did get out finally were immediately met by CIA psychiatrists, the FBI, and they're represented by CIA attorney, and they're in the hands of the federal government. The 13th similarity I see between these two places, as I mentioned before, was the being close to the Argentine border in order that people could escape in case somebody came in to see what was going on. But if somebody escaped because they didn't like the place, the Argentine police could return them, and the same provisions of renting went to the Venezuela condition, that it had to be close walking distance from Venezuela. If they had to get away, and they did use that getaway, some did use the getaway, and as I said, besides the boats, there's about 110 missing. Maybe 60 or 80 went on each boat, but they're missing. Jonestown had its own airfield, besides the main airfield, of course, in Georgetown. Colonia Dignidad had its own airport, its own airfield, and if you saw Boys from Brazil, you see how Mengeles has his own boats and his own airfield that lands, and each of them not only use the airfield of the major cities, a fair distance away, but their transportation, their hospital basket cases, and so forth were brought in. They had their own airfields. One was an agricultural farm, similar. As I say, they were self-contained. The Colonia Dignidad was a agricultural farm completely. Now, Jonestown was supposed to be an agricultural farm. It was passed off as an agricultural farm in the brochures, even though after everybody was killed there, or 913 were killed, it turned out that they ate a bowl of rice a day, sometimes went 24 hours with just a meager amount, and that they weren't even working on the farm. And most of these old black ladies were basket cases like slave ships, kept in rooms and not even fed. And the white people had special kitchens where they ate special food, but they weren't even doing the agricultural work that they were supposed to be doing to eat luxuriously, which they could be doing in that kind of climate. In 1977, I got some literature from Jonestown, update latest from Jonestown, and this is what it says. It says, Charles Gary lived with us several days and nights at the Temple Project in Guyana. He's a man known to speak the truth, and he calls it paradise. In December the 11th, 1977, the Guyana Chronicle had an article written by a dental surgeon who said he never saw so many people of varying races working together. This brochure I got talks about the medical department is considered by many to be the most unique of its kind in this type of community. The staff includes a medical doctor, a pharmacist, a dietitian, a pediatric specialist, several nurse practitioners, a number of registered nurses, many medical assistants, full-time health care workers, and trainees. There's a physical therapy department under the supervision of a licensed therapist. We conduct regular cancer clinics, both in Jonestown and nearby communities. We've been able to treat children from the surrounding areas who have never been so fortunate as to receive skilled care. The medical equipment includes 2 EKG machines, a centrifuge, electronic microscope, an autoclave. We'll soon be getting X-ray machines to be operated by licensed technicians with 20 years of experience. All lab work is done by urinalysis. Blood testing is done by lab technicians. We have just cleared 200 acres of lush jungle land for planting, a continuous process of our agricultural program. We have food stored months ahead of time to prepare for self-sufficiency of the project. To meet protein requirements, we are acquiring milk cows. We already have 2 bulls for the propagation of a herd. The pigs are thriving, and a flock of thousands of chickens have just graduated, 2,000 chicks from modern incubators to add to its population. We are raising a number of rabbits for food. A whole host of craft and cottage industries have taken a hold. This is truly a modern village. The homes are landscaped with fruit trees and gardens and decorative fences. Excellent health of residents here. This is a socialist cooperation. People are seeing their talents used directly to help others. This came out, big capital letters in quotes, Paradise, from Charles Gary in 1977. The cattle, the pigs, the rabbits, the chickens, the herds, the bulls, the protein, the vegetables, the food storage was all a lie. All a lie. None of that was seen after they died. All they found was a medical unit where people were tortured with lobotomies, and the woman who ran it, Mrs. Parks, was shot point blank at the airport, and all of these great cancer clinics and dietitians and pediatric specialists and pharmacists, yes, drugs. One doctor, Lawrence Schock, from Houston, Texas. And all of this propaganda put out by Guyana is the same kind of BS that was going out about these lovely homes, orphanages in Chile and in Jonestown. But this is what the American press was sending out. I was on their mailing list, and I have more to share with you that I've never put on the tapes yet. But the decorative fences and the modern village and the landscaping and the fruit trees, and when it came down to the push and shove, and the congressman, after months and months of hassling, finally said, I'm coming through and I'm bringing the cameras, they found a bunch of old black people chained in bed, and then out comes Terry Buford to say she stuffed herself with pillows and cotton and made a black face and pretended she was cured because Jim wanted to recruit old black people, and she'd run out of a temple, saying that she could walk from being crippled, and take off her black paint, and she was the daughter of a man of Navy intelligence, lived on a Navy base all of her life, entrapping these poor people that had to be poisoned or shot down there. Well, that's the agricultural aspect. One was an agricultural farm in Chile, and the other was an agricultural cattle farm that they pronounced that they had, but there was no evidence except for a dog walking around. They shot their dog when they left. I think only one bird that you couldn't eat or cook for all those people was living in the cage, some kind of a bird, a parrot. That was Jonestown, the agricultural center. No mention of the cows or the rabbits to eat, or the chickens or the chicks, or anything even growing like those fruit trees. Nothing at all. They seemed to use them to grow some food, and that was going very meager at that. Another comparison is that the human rights, as I mentioned before, the Division of Human Rights, Amnesty International, complained in 1977 about the isolation and the economic independence and what was going on, the torturing down in Colonia, DIGNIDAD, and also there were complaints about Jonestown. And it was at this time when people were going to members of Congress and the State Department and complaining about the conditions and beatings and tortures. And it was just then, in 1977, that the brochures were coming out. Paradise, you people have an axe to grind. It's really heaven on earth. And the authorities turned down the appeals in the United States, and the authorities turned down the appeals in the United Nations of the other group and in West Germany, so that they were talking to deaf ears. The Chilean government was sending out brochures that they were liberal, that they were trying to tone down after the coup took place and Pinochet was in power. And the cover for Jim Jones was always a liberal operation. He passed himself off as a liberal. He came from a little town in Lynn, Indiana, 900 people, where his father was a member of the Klan, where black people were chased out of town and couldn't show their faces after sundown, where he took a person from Cuba and said, don't come out on the streets at night because they would kill you. It's not safe to be black here. And then he goes down to Brazil in 1960 and has his entourage of black children and Oriental as a cover, and then begins to accumulate a great amount of money and begin his nursing home up in Ukiah with the help of Tim Stone from Stanford. The liberal image is what they tried to get, and the trick word in fascism is socialism. Hitler came in, his government was a socialist government, and Jim Jones' camp was a socialist experiment. Of course, Jim Jones said, die with dignity, and I mentioned that last week, and the name of the torture camp in Chile was Colonia, DIGNIDAD. I'll do more on the comparisons of this phenomena on the other side of this tape now. Mae Brussell. This is side 2 of tape number 386, April 27th, 1979. You may hear the rain on the roof here. We're having a rainstorm, and I have skylighting at the house, so I think you may pick up a little bit of rain on this tape. Now, to continue with the similarities between the Chilean Colonia Dignidad and Jonestown, another similarity, which I think I covered over just briefly, is that there was no way to escape in either place. One was a Nazi concentration camp. Those who got in there, those children over in Chile, were only taught German. They didn't speak Spanish. They had no way to survive outside of the immediate surroundings, even if they could get over and return to another place. The German was the only language they knew. And in the case of Jonestown, as soon as they arrived, they turned over their passports. They brought down $5,000 each. Their personal tape recorders and radios were removed. I guess they couldn't reconstruct any kind of a radio if they wanted. And then the medical and physical experiments and tortures could begin for the grand finale, which ultimately was death for all of them. And there were at least 2,000 people who died in Chile. They believe that could have died because of the secret compound that DINA, the secret police, uses down in Chile and uses the orphanage agricultural farm for its secrecy. Another similarity is that Jim Jones knew each person, and he got to know their personalities, their strengths and weaknesses, and he could get them to obey his commands. They did what he told them to. He psyched them all out and could play on them beautifully and get them to obey. And down in Chile, the way they tortured the people who got to know them, according to this article in Counterspy, is that they psyched the people out. They knew each person they had. They knew the traits of their individual. The torture sessions were totally debilitating, described by people who escaped or were able to get out of there as totally debilitating, and the people were exhausted, and then they would comply with any demand. Now, that is the way the deaths took place also in Jonestown. When they were ordered to die, they were physically exhausted. The description of some people who survived and escaped said that when they were beat down with long hours of staying up, deprived of food, terrorized, embarrassed publicly, denied privacy, denied nourishment, psychological nourishment, forced to be homosexuals, tortured if they had heterosexual feelings, embarrassed, natural relationships broken up, there really isn't much left besides death. So wanting to die is natural under those circumstances. Would they want to die if they had a choice? Probably not. But when they went down there, did they know that their rights would be taken? Obviously, no. They had no idea. They were told it was a paradise, and they chose it out of a free will. And once they got down there, the passports were taken away. In colonial Dignidad, part of the torture was to drive a detainee insane through the administration of drugs. I have that as the 23rd similarity. As I say, I have 67 similarities between this one article in Counterspy and what I read of Jonestown. And one of Jones' ways to drive a detainee crazy was through drugs. If somebody wanted to leave, they were captured and put in what they called a clinic for a week. And when they came out, they were described as having a lobotomy. Now, a surgical lobotomy just requires nothing more than a needle going into around the eyeball and into the head, into the brain. But they also could do it with drugs. You have a whole list of drugs that have come out in many, many books and articles recently that will do a chemical lobotomy, erase memory, cause you to jump out of a window, such as Mr. Olson of the CIA, a family with a normal wife and family and children who goes to New York City and leaps out a window. Did he want to leap out the window? Obviously not. Would he have a choice? Was he told when he went to the CIA retreat for 3 days, this is what we're going to do? No. Was he suicidal? His wife was told he was for years. Well, this way you can't call it a suicide, even though the books on Jonestown keep talking about the suicide cult. There is nothing suicidal about it any more than Martha Mitchell wanting to die of cancer or Jack Ruby wanting to die of cancer. The decisions were made as soon as these people met up with certain parties, and it went out of their own free will from that point. Another similarity was tape recordings. Jim Jones tape recorded what people said at the meetings. He tape recorded part of the death scene. He very well recorded, like good Nazis recorded, much of their activities and photographed their activities. Jim Jones tape recorded torture sessions. He played them back to friends, and he had microphones at mouths where you heard children screaming louder, so it would be more fearful. And the same thing happened in Chile at the DINA, using the orphanage agricultural farm, had tape recordings of their tortures, and they played them back for other people so that they could hear them and hear the screaming. And that was frightening because you didn't live it once, but you could live it 100 times over. The woman that Adriana Borquez that I quoted in last week's tape said that fascism doesn't respect the personality of each one of us, that dignity, emotions, thoughts, ideas, ideology, religion, habits, morals, social concepts, and everything that goes to make a human being is trampled on by bestiality. Now, Adriana's description of what it is to be dehumanized in an isolation center, again, a Christian orphanage, agricultural farm, where the torturing went on, is exactly the way that Jim Jones dehumanized these other people. When you take away their possessions, when you do fake healings, and the disease is still there, or you promote yourself as healing your cancers and they believing in you when there's no person really to believe in, when you isolate these poor blacks in slave rooms, when you embarrass people, when you punish them for their normal sex, when you force them, after you tell them you love them, to watch you have sex with homosexuals, when you have 10 women and you brag about them, when you have a wife, a married woman, mother of your children, watching you have sex with other men and women, when you take their identities away, like in prison, when you grab up their passports and put them all in a suitcase, no one could keep his or her passport in their own room to say, this is my way home. If I want to go, I can go. If I like it here, I'll stay. I sold my home, I sold my car, I gave my life savings, I believe in him, but if I want to go, here's my ticket. No, they had to turn it over. Every letter that came in was opened, and every letter that went out was dictated. They asked parents to kill their own children. They experimented on with drugs. They had surgery without anesthetics. They were put in boxes. Limbs were broken. They snitched on each other. They were punished constantly. and the ultimate result was 914 dead. It was the same techniques of dehumanization that went on in Jonestown, that went on in Chile, and I think the common denominator was the fascism and the Nazification process that was conducted in Germany, financed by the United States and Britain and the major nations, condoned then, condoned now, covered up then, covered up now. That's another similarity to add to all of the others, is that the major nations, the doctors, the lawyers, the president, the governors, and all of them, they condone it, they cover it, and they continue to experiment. And they not only experiment by it, but they profit from it. They sell the drugs, they hire the guards, they make money at Dover, Delaware. They made $6 million bringing these decayed bodies back. They didn't even identify that they could have done it. If they sent a plane in 4 days later, they could have sent it in the same day. There's profits in this. The newspaper people, the book publishers, everyone makes a buck off of Jonestown. And the situation is continuing, because I know if it has that much protection now, it's because they intend or still have many other Jonestowns. If you stopped covering up, for example, the Kennedy assassination, then you'd know who killed Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King, who arranged the death of Mary Jo Kopechne, or the shooting of George Wallace, or the killing of Nelson Rockefeller, and hundreds of others. If you cracked one and cared, you'd stop the others. And the very fact that every public official on down covers this terrible thing up means that they like it and they know there's more, and you're not supposed to know when it's going to take place next. Another similarity between Colonial Dignidad in Chile and Jonestown was that one began thousands of miles away in a town near Bonn, Germany, Stegberg, Germany. The idea was fomented of taking these orphans and moving them down there as a front for where Martin Bormann, the top Nazis, were meeting just at the time these assassinations were being engineered. And down in Chile, that affected the United States, affected the whole world. It began in Germany. It was born in Germany in a town named Stegberg, and then it moved down to Chile, the orphanage farm. The same way in the Jonestown case. It began in Bloomington or Richmond, Indiana. Then Jim Jones moved down to Brazil. There's a book out there, many books on the Jonestown story. I have all of them. There's one that describes how Jones, in 1953, sold monkeys, which is another thing to be investigated. That is the tallest story, how he would start a small church selling monkeys. I think they were to Dr. Delgado for his experiments. That was in 53, and in 64, he came back to be ordained as a priest in the Disciple of Christ church. He was a minister. He wasn't ordained when he went to Brazil. He went there in the early 60s, and that's when he applied for the acreage. He saw that land down there in 1963. He was in Brazil 62, 63 with the CIA. Then he went back in 64 and was ordained a minister in the Disciples of Christ church, and then took his $100,000 and went to Ukiah, took 100 people from Indiana and went to Ukiah in 1965 and held them together and opened a temple, bought a Jewish synagogue on Geary Street in San Francisco and another one in Los Angeles in 71. In 73, the same year that Chile was overthrown and Allende was murdered, was when Jim Jones moved down headquarters and rented that land that he had seen in 63, 10 years earlier, and began to cultivate the politicians in San Francisco and Los Angeles in the statewide, so that when he moved down there, he would have the respect and isolation of the officials that he had met. The arrangements were made 10 years earlier in 63. The property was rented in 73, and then he begins to meet the politicians. But in both cases of these agricultural farms used for torture and experimentation, they began in their mother countries, in Germany and in the United States. And the important thing is that the German-United States Gehlen Nazi operations were thick and consistent and one. The CIA and Gehlen cannot be separated. And then they went down to Chile and went down to Guyana to begin experimenting on people. In 1958, a Paul Schaefer, the equivalent of Jim Jones, Schaefer, had a Bible study group in Germany, and he formed what he called the private social mission, whose purpose, in quotes, was to develop a Christian community, along with, in quotes, the external trappings of a religious sect, according to the man who wrote the article in Counterspy. And their project was to help needy and endangered juveniles. And Jim Jones picked up on all the derelicts, the people that nobody wanted, the poor, the drug addicts. Around him were a top echelon of college people and professors, Dr. Goodlett, Tim Stone, both from Stanford, and a lot of professors. This Dr. Lawrence Layton, father of Larry Layton, who's down in jail in Georgetown right now for the ambush at the airport, charged with some of the shootings at the airport. The entourage was intellectual and wealthy, and the social mission were the derelicts that they were supposed to take care of. Well, it was in '58 when Paul Schaefer got his group together, and it was in that era of 1958, 1960, Jim Jones was collecting his monkeys, collecting children, blacks, Koreans, for another social mission. And in 1965, he opened this new place of worship in Indiana, and then moved out to California. He took 100 people out for his black and white community in California, where one author described it as the place where Charles Manson held sway over his cult. He brought these people from Indianapolis, and some of them from farther east, 100 of them, and it was supposed to be a model of liberalism and integration, and he was supposed to help people find jobs, and this was to help the needy, the crippled, the sick, in both cases. Another similarity is that the mission down in Chile, started by Paul Schaefer, grew rapidly. It had, as I say, financial independence, and the bulk of the wages for this mission were donated by people who worked. They turned over their wages, and they got tax-exempt status because it was a church, and the religious institution couldn't be investigated because of the privacy of religion. We have the privacy of the legal profession, the medical profession, and the church, and being as the extermination and the conspiracies are all centered in the legal profession, the medical profession, and the church, it's a catch-22. You can't investigate any of them because of the lawyer-client privilege, and you can't have women testifying against their husband where wives are involved with the men in these conspiracies. So it's almost impossible to break them open with this kind of privacy when they're not really practicing good medicine, they're not obeying the law, and they're not religious. They're not Christian, certainly, and they're breaking all the standards of the legal profession, the medical profession, and the church, and they get tax deductions and get protection for their crimes because the law calls them religious institutions. Jim Jones developed his mission after he went to Brazil, and he became quickly wealthy, the same way that Mr. Paul Schaefer accumulated a large amount of money to take down to Chile. Jim Jones had $100,000 to put into a nursing home. In 1965, he was considered rich, and then people began to donate homes and property, and then he collected institutions, so that very early, by 1971, he had over $1.5 million in real estate holdings. Now, it's funny, if you think about the logic of this, Jim Jones was supposed to be collecting the derelicts, the drug addicts, the drunkards, the people that couldn't get jobs, the very poor. Yet he was amassing millions of money and millions of dollars of real estate and money for brochures and postage and buses. If the money was coming from the poor, he wouldn't have all that money. The money was coming from the very rich to round up the poor, and that's why he had the money. And the poor were treated like poor, and the rich, in this case, had special privileges, just like I'm sure the people in Chile had over the children and orphans, that they put and used the children as a shield for their various crimes. In 1960, the director of the Chilean Colonial DIGNIDAD, Paul Schaefer, had this private mission, a children's home in West Germany, and the opening was attended by the Minister for Family Affairs, and he got recognition from the political establishment in the German town, honored by the local politicians. Jim Jones got his Bachelor's of Art, married a nurse, he became a pastor in Indianapolis, and in 1961, 1 year after Mr. Schaefer had opened his German orphanage, Jim Jones became head of the city's Human Rights Commission for Indianapolis. Mayor Charles Boswell appointed Jim Jones director of the city's Human Rights Commission 1 year after the opening ceremonies, where Mrs. Freisich of West Germany, the Ministry of Family Affairs, was recognizing and honoring the head of the orphanage in Germany. They had recognition by local politicians, and then later Jim Jones went on to be on the Housing Commission and recognized by George Moscone in San Francisco, and was on the grand jury up in Ukiah. Another similarity, number 29, as I say, I numbered 67 or almost 70 similarities between these two, was that they both had positions right in the community of political expertise and were recognized by the political officials and put on commissions. Jim Jones first the Human Rights Commission in Indiana, the grand jury up in Ukiah, and the housing appointed by George Moscone, mayor of San Francisco, the Housing Commission in San Francisco. Another similarity is that as Colonial Dignidad was described as being on the surface benevolent, communal, a social mission, very generous and kind, where actually it was an entangling web of repressions. There were physical and psychological manipulations. Jim Jones had the same thing. On the surface, it was the love of the Orientals and the blacks, the mixed black and whites. Actually, he hated the blacks. He referred to them as niggers. He was a racist. He gave them jobs where it was the slave labor type of thing, and the whites had the privileged work in the radio rooms. They had separate housing and separate food and separate privileges. So on the surface, both projects were benevolent and communal and kind, and underneath they were both racist and fascist, and Jim Jones hadn't gone any further than the Klan Nazi mentality of Indiana, and the same thing was taking place in Germany before they moved this commune down to Chile. Another similarity is that Paul Schaefer's church was controlled through brainwashing confessions. He had absolute control besides dehumanizing. That's something different. He had communal confessions of various members of the church, and they would come to him as a single person and tell them everything they did wrong and every sin, and he would get to know them. And each member of his group became increasingly dependent upon Paul Schaefer. That's written in the article Counterspy. When you read that, you can't help but see the comparisons between Jim Jones, where everybody had to call him dad or father, and they had to confess, and they signed confessions to him, false confessions on pieces of paper, that they had murdered public officials, that they had molested young children, they had molested their own children, that there was this incest. He dehumanized them by making them sign and agree to any crime that could be committed, that put their name on blank pieces of paper. And he did the religious story, come up and confess, child, and I'm father, and sleep with the picture, buy my picture, and sleep with me, and love me. So that one of the ways of control, psyching them out, was that they each played a religious role in, like, similar to the Catholic Church with the confession. But it was a form of brainwashing because they were the only thing to the members, the young people and the older people also. In the Catholic Church, you can be out at large, come in and confess, and then go home and go about your daily business. But the very people who confessed down in Jonestown or Colonial Dignidad lived within an area where there were dogs, guards, and police. And after you confessed your inner souls, you couldn't go anywhere to escape or start over. You had to live in that small area. And that is what they had in common. They describe in this article, the author describes encounters with the help of various people. Yuko Barr was one, and Herman Schmidt and other leaders, that Mr. Schaefer had a system of total control of mission members, that every member was controlled in every sense of their lives. And that also is what happened down in Jonestown. You have Tim and Grace Stone, who escaped, talking about the control, or Dr. Goodlett, who was shipping medications for these black people, a black doctor from Stanford who was shipping down, and Charles Gary, who was white, or David Phillips, who escaped, and the Layton family, Dr. Layton from Army Research Bacteriological Warfare Chief, involved in agricultural experiments. He's alive. These people from Stanford, these well-educated, upper-class people from England, the United States, maintained total control over the members, and they also controlled the media so that stories couldn't get out. Another comparison was that they used the doctrine that a Christian, in order to be a real Christian, had to be free from family relations. As Mr. Schaefer told his members to break up with their families, that they couldn't be members of his church if they had families. Now, Jim Jones isolated families. When he had couples down there that were married, he broke up the marriages. He had them shift, and then he would take on one of the divorced women as his mate. And as I mentioned before, he didn't like young men and women together or doing favors for each other and causing them to be embarrassed and humiliated and punished. And he isolated members of the families and forced homosexuality and bragged about homosexuality. So under the guise of religion, all past affections had to be broken. And, of course, this is a different kind of religion than traditional religion. That even the Catholic Church doesn't condone divorce, or didn't. They want you to stay together forever. But in this case, in Chile, that came from Germany, or in Jonestown, the Christianity of it discouraged close relationships except to the sole leader, and that was one means of control, but something they had in common. Another thing they had in common, I'm down to 34, was that the parents made frequent attempts to visit children in Germany, whose children went off to Chile and were often couldn't. And the children of legal age couldn't go home, and if the parents went to the doors where the small children were, they were turned away. Once they got in charge of those children, this mission, this Christian mission in Germany, and the Jonestown too, the parents were discouraged. Mrs. Katsaris felt badly that Marie was at the University of California. They went over to Jim Jones, and she'd visit her and get the cold shoulder, and then said later she felt badly that she didn't pursue it or stay with it. You can't break contact with people. You have to stay with them and let them go back and forth to the family so that they can see the family is behind them. But in the case of Mrs. Bouquet, she was not allowed to see her son before he died, or Mr. Harris, who went down to Georgetown, or Grace Stone, or many other people who tried to see the children. They were not allowed to see, and families were separated. And this happened in both groups. Family groups were destroyed, and this was part of the effectiveness. Not only could parents not visit with their children, but husbands and wives were forced to separate in both groups. And in the case of breaking up marital situations, many men left Jonestown, and the wife and children were there. A man grieves today. He lost many members of his family. Families were split. Children were taken from parents. And another similarity was in the murdering of children and families. In September 1967, an Elfriede Gerlach killed her own children, 3 children, and then committed suicide because her husband, Helmut, was a member of this religious sect, this Christian orphanage mission, social mission. And it reminded me of Mrs. Amos, Mrs. Harris, down in Jonestown, who killed, or supposedly had Mr. Beichman help her kill her children, and then he killed her. She held the hair back, and the throats were cut, and 3 children were killed, and then the woman was killed. And this type of thing took place in the other sect also, which is terribly unusual. I don't think it's a common thing to be happening, but there's so many parallels between the two sects and the origin of the sects and the behavior that it doesn't surprise me that even down to the numbers and the grossness of this type of thing, you see these parallels. In 1966, Paul Schaefer described how he got control over the members of his agricultural commune down in Chile. A former member described and said, well, he's the minister as I said before, he went to them for confessions. They tell him their thoughts. The dependency on him grew more and more, and this was the only way to eternal life, was to trust him, and they had fear of being lost if they ever left the group. And that's the control Jim Jones had. He said, the outside will take us, they'll torture your children, it's better to die with dignity. They called him Dad, and they had to put their trust into him, and he says, die fast, take the poison. And many who wouldn't have voluntarily had injections, and we don't know, the recorder went off, how many were shot. But you have to die. The outside is bad, and I'm the only one that can protect you. And if they're going to come down on us, we all have to go together. It was the same type of threats, the same brainwashing of the two leaders. In the one case, Paul Schaefer, and the other, Jim Jones, only Schaefer's still alive, running his shtick down there, because nobody can get in and break it open. That's why he's alive, because the West German government, the United States government, the United Nations government doesn't go on down to Chile and break in to see what's going on. It's because they condone it that it's going on, and it's because we still live in a democracy, or a semblance of a democracy. When Congressman Leo Ryan wanted to go there, then they had to go ahead and kill everybody, so we wouldn't know how far along in the mind control processing these people were. In 1960, Mr. Schaefer was arrested in West Germany by police on charges of sexually abusing children in his own home. And in 1973, Jim Jones was arrested for lewd conduct in Los Angeles, but had already made plans to take children and minors down to Guyana, so the arrest records, as we said on another tape, were destroyed, and he got off that rap. They did send the children to him, and the similarities are there in that they were both arrested for sexual problems, the two leaders, but they both had help from the law and got off and were still given the custody of these children. October 1961 is when the land was purchased in Chile from a group called the Italian Real Estate Company, CITAL, C-I-T-A-L, and it was in 1963 that Jim Jones visited Matthew Ridge and saw the property on Guyana that would become his farm 2 years later, to be known as Jonestown, and then he returned in 1973 to start living there. 1961 is when Schaefer's group got the property purchased from the Italian firm that was the German home base. It became the private social mission in Germany, in West Germany, bought the German property, the army, the military, bought his property in Germany, and then the Italian company bought the land down there in Chile in October 61 when they moved this great commune agricultural farm on down to Chile. I still have 23 more comparisons of colonial dignidad to Jonestown, and because it is so important, I think next week, maybe on the tape, I'll wind it up by doing those 23 comparisons and then getting back to some of the other news, but this is so terribly important that I think we should share this information and the comparisons. Have a good week, and we'll be back next week and continue on some of this information.